Your leadership style is too rigid for our culture, Victoria announced to the entire management team. Not in private, not with any warning. Right there in the Monday morning meeting with every department head watching. My name is Colin Drake, 47 years old, operations director at Iron Veil Robotics for 7 years, until about 10 minutes ago. I nodded once, closed my laptop and said, "Understood." Victoria had been president for all of 8 weeks. Brought in by investors who wanted someone with vision and presence to make the company more attractive for acquisition. She wore designer suits, used phrases like synergistic alignment, and had never once visited our manufacturing floor. I cleared my office without argument. 22 minutes flat. One cardboard box for personal items, another for the binders I'd meticulously built over 7 years. Vendor contacts, pricing structures, delivery schedules. The invisible architecture holding everything together. "Colin, this isn't personal," Victoria said, appearing in my doorway as I packed, her voice softer now that we were alone. "We just need someone with a more collaborative approach." I kept packing. The past 4 quarters speak for themselves. Numbers aren't everything in modern business. I didn't bother explaining that those numbers, the $12 million in annual revenue, up from $5 million when I started, came from relationships, from trust built slowly, methodically, with suppliers across the Midwest, from handshakes and site visits and remembering names of people's kids. Victoria wouldn't understand that my rigid leadership style was what kept raw materials arriving on time during the supply chain collapse of 2023, that my outdated processes were why we could price our products 6% lower than competitors and still maintain healthy margins. I shook hands with my team on the way out, wished them success. I meant it. Good people who deserved better than what was coming. On the drive home, my phone lit up with messages. Shocked colleagues, confused vendors who'd already somehow heard. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned toward the Mississippi River and parked at an overlook. For the first time in 7 years, I had nowhere to be at 1 p.m. on a Monday. "Congratulations on your freedom," I muttered to myself, watching barges push against the current below. I knew what would happen next. I'd seen this movie before. The first hints were already there in Victoria's office. The MBA jargon, the vendor portal software she'd mentioned implementing, the consulting firm she'd brought in to modernize procurement. What she didn't know was that every major supplier contract was personally negotiated by me, built on handshakes and mutual respect, not software platforms. There was no transition plan because nobody had asked for one, and now nobody ever would. I joined Iron Veil when they were a struggling outfit in an old warehouse near the rail yard. Their product line, specialized factory automation components, was solid, but they couldn't deliver consistently enough to land major contracts. The owner, Harold Blackwell, was an engineering genius with no mind for logistics. "I need someone who can fix this damn supply chain mess," Harold had told me during my interview, pointing to a whiteboard covered in delivery delays and cost overruns. "You military guys understand systems. Make this work and I'll make it worth your while." After 15 years as a logistics officer in the Army, I knew how to build reliable supply chains, not by bullying vendors into submission, that never works long-term, but by creating mutual dependency. Partnerships where both sides had skin in the game. I spent that first year on the road, visited every critical supplier personally, learned their capabilities, their constraints, their aspirations. Some were small family operations in places like Lima, Ohio, or Dubuque, Iowa. Others were divisions of larger corporations where the right relationship with a purchasing manager meant priority status during shortages. By year 3, we had the region's most robust supply network. When competitors were shutting down production lines due to parts shortages, we kept running. Our delivery reliability hit 98.6%. Customer retention reached 91%. Harold understood the value. "Whatever you're doing with these suppliers, keep doing it," he'd say at our monthly reviews. "Best investment I ever made was bringing you on." But Harold sold the company last spring, said he was ready to retire, fish more, see his grandkids. The investment group that bought Iron Veil immediately started professionalizing operations. New software, new reporting structures, new KPIs. And finally, Victoria. The first crack appeared during her second week. She canceled my quarterly supplier visit trip, calling it an unnecessary expense in the digital age. The second came during a strategy meeting where she dismissed my concerns about changing payment terms with key vendors. "They'll adjust," she said confidently. "We're too important to them." The third was overhearing her tell someone on the phone that operations was stuck in the last century and needed fresh blood. I could have fought harder, could have explained that our success was built on precisely the old-school approach she was dismantling, that our suppliers worked with us because of trust, not just transactions. But I recognized the pattern. I'd seen it in the military too. New leadership determined to make their mark by changing what already works. So I started making copies of my contact lists, backing up my notes, preparing for the inevitable. When it came, the only surprise was the public nature of my dismissal. 3 days after my firing, Thomas Franklin called, chief engineer at Falwyn Security, one of our biggest customers. "Heard what happened," he said. "Their loss. Listen, you free for lunch? No agenda, just two old guys complaining about the world." We met at a steakhouse downtown. Thomas was pushing 60, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades building things before moving into management. "So what's next for Colin Drake?" he asked after we ordered. "Taking some time, evaluating options." Thomas nodded. "Heard from anyone at Iron Veil?" Radio silence. "Not surprised. Victoria's already making waves. Announced a new vendor management system yesterday. Mandatory for all suppliers." He studied my face. "You didn't set that up, did you?" "No. All our vendor relationships were personal. Direct lines of communication. Real people solving real problems." "That's what I figured." Thomas leaned forward. "Look, Colin, I'm going to be straight with you. We're already seeing delays from Iron Veil. Nothing major yet, but the warning signs are there. Your replacement is some kid from business school who talks about strategic procurement, but doesn't know the difference between grade 5 and grade 8 fasteners." I took a sip of water, trying to mask my reaction. It was happening faster than I'd expected. "Not your problem anymore," Thomas continued. "But here's what is interesting. Wyston Bioworks is looking for someone to overhaul their operations. Their CEO, Julia Winters, is an old friend. When I heard what happened to you, I mentioned your name. I appreciate that, but she wants to meet you. They're expanding, and their current setup can't handle the growth. Sound familiar?" It did. Exactly like Iron Veil 7 years ago. As we finished lunch, my phone buzzed. A text from Harold, my old boss. "Just heard. What the hell were they thinking? Call me." On the drive home, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. I was past that. Something colder, more calculated. Victoria had made a critical error. She'd assumed the systems I built were transferable, that relationships could be managed through software and form emails, that suppliers would stick with Iron Veil out of inertia or necessity. She didn't understand that I'd structured every major contract to require personal renegotiation annually. No auto-renewals, no standard terms, each one customized, with me as the point of contact. It wasn't sabotage, it was how I'd always operated. Personal accountability built into the system, my system. That evening I received my first email from Iron Veil since the firing. Not from Victoria, but from purchasing. Urgent. Need vendor contact information for Midwest Precision. Their representative says they only deal with Colin Drake. I didn't reply. Instead, I called Harold back. Then Julia Winters at Wyston Bioworks. Then 3 other companies who'd tried to hire me away over the years. By Friday, I had 4 solid offers. By Monday, I'd made my decision. I wasn't just going to rebuild somewhere else. I was going to show Victoria exactly what she'd thrown away. 2 weeks after my firing, I accepted the Chief Operations Officer position at Wyston Bioworks. They manufactured specialized laboratory equipment, different products from Iron Veil but similar supply chain challenges. Julia Winters, their CEO, gave me full authority to rebuild their operations from the ground up. "We need what you built at Iron Vale," she said during our final interview. "Our growth is outpacing our infrastructure. Fix it, and there's equity in it for you." I spent my first day walking the floor talking to line workers, getting the unfiltered truth about what worked and what didn't. By day 3, I had identified their critical weaknesses: unreliable component deliveries, quality inconsistencies from key suppliers, and wasteful inventory practices. That Friday, my personal phone rang. Victoria Lang's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was polite but tense. "Colin, hope you're well. We're having some challenges with supplier transitions. Wondering if you might be available for a brief consultation? Compensated, of course." I didn't call back. Monday morning, my administrative assistant forwarded an email that had come through Wystan's general contact form. "Urgent request from Victoria Lang, president of Iron Vale Robotics." I deleted it without reading further. By Wednesday, she was calling my personal phone every few hours. I blocked her number. On Thursday, she showed up at Wystan's reception area. "Mr. Drake is in meetings all day," the receptionist told her, following my standing instructions for any Iron Vale visitors. "Tell him it's urgent," Victoria insisted. "We have a major production delay that's about to cost us millions." I watched through the security feed from my office as she waited for 30 minutes before leaving, her perfect composure finally cracking. That afternoon, I received a detailed email from Brian Cooper, my former assistant at Iron Vale. We'd stayed in touch, and he'd become my eyes and ears inside the company. "Complete chaos," he wrote. "Midwest Precision raised prices 15% on the new contract. Volari Components pushed delivery dates out 6 weeks. 3 other vendors have capacity issues that mysteriously only affect Iron Vale orders. Victoria's called 4 emergency management meetings this week alone." I hadn't asked these vendors to punish Iron Vale. I hadn't needed to. They'd seen how I was treated and drawn their own conclusions about the new leadership. Some had worked with me for years, across multiple companies. They knew who kept promises and who didn't. The next morning, Harold Blackwell called. "The board is starting to ask questions," he said. Harold had kept a 15% stake in Iron Vale after selling. "Victoria's blaming vendor hostility for the delays. Says you poisoned the well on your way out." "I've had 0 contact with any Iron Vale vendors since I left," I replied truthfully. "I believe you. But she's convinced herself she's the victim here." Harold paused. "They lost the Braxton contract yesterday. Couldn't guarantee delivery dates." Braxton Industries. A client I'd personally cultivated for 3 years before they finally signed on. One of Iron Vale's largest accounts. "Not my concern anymore," I said. "Of course not," Harold agreed. "By the way, how's the new gig?" "Different challenges, similar solutions." I hesitated. "I might need to bring on some additional manufacturing capacity soon. Know anyone looking to sublease factory space?" Harold chuckled. "Funny you should ask. I might have some leverage to help with that very soon." A week later, I received a formal letter from Iron Vale's legal department, claiming I had violated non-solicitation agreements by interfering with their vendor relationships. I forwarded it to Julia's legal team without comment. Their response came back within hours. No merit, no evidence, no concern. They were right. I hadn't solicited anyone. I had simply stepped aside and let reality take its course. That night I slept better than I had in months. A month into my new role at Wystan, I received a message on LinkedIn from Eleanor Hayes, Iron Vale's head of finance. We'd worked well together during my time there, both of us detail-oriented, process-driven professionals who preferred results over politics. "Can we meet?" was all she wrote. We chose a coffee shop halfway between our offices. Eleanor looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from fighting unwinnable battles. "They're blaming you for everything," she said after we sat down. "The vendor issues, the production delays, the lost contracts. Victoria's built this narrative that you sabotaged the company on your way out." I stirred my coffee. That would require planning I didn't have time for, given the 10-minute notice of my termination. I know. But here's what you don't know. Eleanor lowered her voice. Victoria was brought in specifically to cut costs and prep the company for a quick flip. The investors want to sell within 18 months. They need to show consistent 20% margins. Ironvale was already profitable, I noted. Not profitable enough for them. Your vendor contracts were too fair. They protected both sides. She pulled out her tablet, opened a spreadsheet. Look at these targets. They need to squeeze an additional 12% out of the supply chain. I studied the numbers. Impossible without gutting quality or shifting to overseas suppliers, which would create months of production gaps and destroy the company's reputation for reliability. There's more, Eleanor continued. Victoria didn't fire you because of your leadership style. She fired you because you were the only one who would have challenged these targets. The rest of us were kept in the dark until after you were gone. That's why it was so public, I realized. A warning to everyone else. Eleanor nodded. Exactly, and it worked. Nobody's pushing back. So why tell me this? She closed her tablet. Because I handed in my resignation yesterday. I'm not participating in what comes next. And... She hesitated. There's a board meeting next week. They're going to discuss emergency measures, including potentially closing the St. Paul facility and moving production to Mexico. 200 jobs. Gone. Harold won't let that happen, I said. Harold's being pressured to sell his remaining shares. They're making it very difficult for him to say no. I walked Eleanor to her car, thanked her for the information, and drove straight to Harold's house. I found him in his garage, tinkering with an old motorcycle. They're going to gut the company, I told him, relaying what Eleanor had shared. Harold put down his wrench, wiped his hands on a rag. I've been feeling the squeeze. Bastards want my shares at 10% below what they're worth. Don't sell. Easy for you to say. You're not getting calls from their lawyers every day. I leaned against his workbench. What if there was another option? What if Wyston acquired Ironvale instead? Harold stared at me. You're serious? Julia's looking to expand. She needs manufacturing capacity. Ironvale needs leadership that values what it's built. It makes sense. Victoria's investors wouldn't sell to you. Too much ego involved now. They would if Ironvale was on the verge of collapse, if their only hope of recovering their investment was a fire sale. I met his eyes. How long until the cash flow problems become critical? Harold thought for a moment. At the current burn rate? 6 weeks, maybe 8. And if key suppliers continued to have capacity issues? If more customers followed Braxton out the door? A slow smile spread across Harold's face. Colin Drake, you calculating son of a gun. I'm not suggesting anything unethical, I clarified. I'm merely speculating on market conditions. Of course, Harold nodded. Purely hypothetical. That night, I drafted an email to Julia outlining an acquisition opportunity that would solve our manufacturing constraints and give us access to complementary product lines and customer relationships. I wasn't orchestrating Ironvale's downfall. Victoria and her investors were doing that all by themselves. I was simply positioning Wystan to pick up the pieces and save those 200 jobs in the process. For the next month, I focused entirely on strengthening Wystan's operations. We implemented new inventory controls, streamlined production flows, and established clear quality standards. More importantly, I rebuilt their supplier relationships using the same approach that had worked at Ironvale: personal connections, mutual benefit, and long-term thinking. Meanwhile, Ironvale's situation deteriorated exactly as I'd predicted. Not because I interfered, but because Victoria's aggressive cost-cutting and impersonal vendor management created natural consequences. 3 more clients suspended orders this week, Brian texted me. Production's running at 40% capacity. They've started layoffs. I forwarded the update to Julia, adding it to the acquisition case I was building. She'd been initially skeptical, but was coming around as the financial advantages became clearer. If we move, it needs to be soon, she responded. before they lose too much value. The following Friday, I received an unexpected visitor at Whiston. Thomas Franklin, my contact from Falwyn Security, showed up unannounced. "Got time for lunch?" he asked. "Over sandwiches at a nearby deli," he explained his presence. "We're pulling all our business from Iron Vale. Can't rely on them anymore." "Sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it. Despite everything, I took no pleasure in seeing good people hurt by bad leadership. "We need a new supplier," Thomas continued. "Someone who can deliver the components we need without drama. Someone like Wyston." I set down my sandwich. "We don't currently manufacture the same components as Iron Vale." "But you could," Thomas smiled, "with the right equipment and expertise." "Hypothetically, yes. What if I told you Falwyn is prepared to sign a 3-year contract with significant volume guarantees? Enough to justify setting up a new production line?" This wasn't just an opportunity for Wyston. It was leverage for the acquisition. A guaranteed customer base would make Iron Vale's assets and workforce even more valuable to us. "I'd need to discuss it with Julia," I said. "But it's certainly interesting." When I brought the proposal to Julia that afternoon, along with updated information on Iron Vale's declining situation, she made her decision. "Make them an offer," she said, "but do it through Harold first. Test the waters before we show our full hand." I called Harold that evening and outlined the plan. He would approach Victoria's investment group, presenting himself as a concerned former owner with a potential lifeline, an interested buyer willing to acquire Iron Vale at a reduced but fair price. "Won't mention Wystan or you initially," Harold confirmed. "Just gauge their desperation." "Perfect." 3 days later, Harold called back. "They bid harder than I expected, barely negotiated. They want out before next quarter's financials hit." "Did they ask who the buyer is?" "Of course. I told them a private investment group. They didn't push, they're too eager to stop the bleeding." We moved quickly after that. Julia assembled the acquisition team, with me providing detailed information on Iron Vale's assets, capabilities, and remaining strengths. We structured the deal to retain as many employees as possible, people I knew personally, whose skills and dedication deserved better than what Victoria had given them. 2 weeks later, with the preliminary agreement in place, it was time to reveal Wystan as the buyer, and me as the architect of the acquisition. The meeting was set for Monday morning at Iron Vale's headquarters, exactly 3 months after my very public dismissal. I selected my suit carefully that morning, not to impress Victoria, but out of respect for the moment. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. I walked into Iron Vale's conference room at precisely 9 a.m., followed by Julia and our legal team. Victoria's face when she saw me was worth every sleepless night of the past 3 months. "What is this?" she demanded, looking from me to Harold to her investors. "Mr. Drake is here representing the acquiring company," Harold explained calmly. "This is a joke," Victoria stood up. "We're not selling to him." The lead investor, a thin man named Jeffrey Pearson, cleared his throat. "The preliminary agreement has been signed, Victoria. Wystan Bioworks is acquiring Iron Vale's assets, and Mr. Drake will be overseeing the integration." "You can't do this," she insisted. "He's the reason we're in this situation. He sabotaged our vendor relationships." I remained standing, hands clasped behind my back. "I haven't contacted a single Iron Vale vendor since my departure. I'd be happy to provide phone records, emails, and sworn statements confirming that fact." "Then how do you explain?" "What you're experiencing," I interrupted calmly, "is the natural consequence of treating business relationships as transactions rather than partnerships. Those vendors didn't need me to tell them how little you valued them." Julia stepped forward, taking control of the meeting. "We're here to finalize the acquisition terms. Wystan will retain majority ownership, with Harold maintaining his current stake. We'll keep the Iron Vale brand and as many employees as operations can support." Victoria looked to Jeffrey and the other investors for support, but found none. They were cutting their losses, and she was just another liability to shed. "What about me?" she finally asked. Julia glanced at me, then back to Victoria. "Your services won't be needed during the transition or beyond." Victoria gathered her papers with shaking hands. "You planned this from the beginning," she accused me. "You set me up to fail." I shook my head. "No, Victoria. You did that all by yourself when you decided that relationships didn't matter, when you dismissed 7 years of work without taking the time to understand it." She left without another word. The investors stayed, eager to complete the deal that would salvage at least part of their investment. I felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty that justice had been served. 6 months later, I stood on the manufacturing floor of the newly integrated Wystan Iron Vale operation. We'd kept 185 of the original 200 jobs, consolidated administrative functions, and expanded production capabilities. Most importantly, we'd rebuilt the vendor relationships that had made Iron Vale successful in the first place. It took time, trust, and transparency, explaining our vision, honoring past commitments, and creating new partnerships built on mutual respect. The combined company was on track to hit $20 million in annual revenue, nearly double what Iron Vale had achieved at its peak. Julia had made good on her equity promise, making me a minority owner with real skin in the game. As I completed my daily walkthrough, Brian, now our production manager, approached with a tablet. "Midwest Precision just confirmed the new delivery schedule," he reported. "And Valeri Components agreed to the quality improvement program, said they appreciate the return to the old way of doing business. Good. Let's visit them both next month. See the improvements firsthand." Brian nodded. "By the way, heard anything about Victoria? Consulting for a private equity firm in Chicago, last I heard. Think she learned anything from all this?" I considered the question as we walked past workers assembling laboratory equipment alongside robotics components, the integrated product lines that gave us our competitive edge. "Probably not the right lesson," I finally answered. "People rarely do." That evening I stayed late, reviewing plans for our next expansion. Harold stopped by on his way out, a fishing trip planned for the weekend. "You proved your point," he said, leaning against my office doorway. "Built it back better than before." "Wasn't about proving a point." Harold smiled. "Sure, Colin. Whatever helps you sleep at night." I returned to my paperwork after he left, but my mind drifted to that day by the Mississippi, when I sat watching barges fight the current. Sometimes, going with the flow isn't the answer. Sometimes you have to push back, not with anger or vengeance, but with quiet determination. I hadn't set out to destroy Victoria or to take over Iron Vale. I'd simply refused to let good work be undone by someone who couldn't see its value. That was revenge enough.